Hey everyone, Ethan Oster here, editor of The People's Recorder. One of the many joys of working on this series is having the opportunity to use voices from the past and personal stories to retell a history that we can all connect with. Today's interview is no exception. Before her passing in 2021, Loretta Metoxen served as the tribal historian for the Oneida Nation. For 22 years, she was tasked with preserving, documenting, and interpreting her people's history, culture, language, and traditions. Having learned directly from the WPA's Oscar Archiquette, Loretta is clear in her reflections on the groundbreaking work of the Oneida writers during the Depression and its impact today. Interviewed for Spark Media's award-winning documentary, Soul of a People, Voices from the Writers Project, Loretta's knowledge of Oneida history is invaluable in framing life for her people at the time of the project. Listening to Loretta's words reminds me that the work of historians is not that different from the work I do as an editor, curating and synthesizing information to weave together a narrative that makes for a cohesive and hopefully thought-provoking story. Voices like Loretta Metoxen's connect stories of the past with the present and help us better understand our own place in America's colorful tapestry of experiences and cultures. Before we dive in, just one note in the name of full transparency. In the original recording from 2006, the interviewer was not wearing a microphone and therefore cannot be easily heard. So for that reason, you will hear my voice asking the questions as they were posed by the original interviewer. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Oneida tribal historian Loretta Metoxen. Tell me a bit about around the time of the Depression when this project came about. What was life in Oneida like?
The Oneidas were reduced in their land holdings in New York from 6 million acres to 270,000 acres reservation in Wisconsin. And by the time of the Great Depression in 1929, the Oneidas were 99% landless. If they had no land, they had no farming economy at all. So they had no economy at the time of the Great Depression. And that is the time when the Writers Project began on the Oneida Reservation about 1939. And the byproduct of all of this was to preserve the Oneida language and to preserve stories of the Oneidas that went back to the time of their removal from the state of New York to Wisconsin.
As far as the land not being there anymore, how did that impact members of the tribe during the Depression?
Well, very few people had employment, so the Indian people had no employment. They no longer had their original farms, and they often had to work for the European immigrant farmers who came into the reservation for room and board. And so room and board did not give any income to a man's family. Often the Oneida man who was working for a European immigrant farmer got vegetables and milk and milk products to help feed his family, but very little else.
So if they had had the land, how would the situation have been different for them, the Oneida?
Oneidas were good farmers. When they came from New York to Wisconsin, they cultured oxen teams. Oxen teams were very effective in the high snow, and they would log. They would cut the timber and make their own homes, their own log homes. They would cut enough timber to make a clearing for the white corn and beans and squash that are traditional foods for them for thousands of years.
So once they arrived in Wisconsin and they were stripped of their land, if all they knew was farming, what other job opportunities were there for Oneida?
Farming and logging, but they were prohibited from logging their own timber. There was a Supreme Court case in 1873 called the Cook case, where the federal government charged a non-Indian man from purchasing timber from an Indian woodcutter. And the case was determined that Indian people could not cut trees on a reservation because the title was held by the United States government, and anything attached to that land above the surface would go with the title, and anything beneath the surface, such as minerals, would also go with the title. So the title was held with the United States government and not with the Indian people who resided thereon.
So it seems like the community was slowly being ripped apart piece by piece, and the Great Depression was sort of the apex of the community getting disintegrated in a way. What shape was the Oneida community in at the time of the Great Depression in terms of that sense of community?
By the Great Depression, the Oneidas were in destitute circumstances and could not even rely on one another. So there was a lot of out-migration attempting to find work, and often the Oneida men would travel north to other reservations, to the Menominee Reservation, to the Bad River, the Lac du Flambeau, the Le Coudray reservations, where they were still cutting timber. And so they were good loggers, good workers, and they went there for work also.
So if everybody was sort of breaking apart and going in different directions, what did that mean for the history and culture of the tribe?
We can plot on a continuum the high points of the tribe as a whole and the low points of the tribe as a whole also. And I think that when the Great Depression came in 1929, that it was an extremely low point for the Oneida tribe. Another low point, of course, was when 10% of our population left to fight for the North in the Civil War.
And as far as the Depression low point is, outside of the economic impacts and being without land, can you talk about what made it a low point?
Well, the people had built these homes, these log homes. If the land was lost, they would have lost their home also. So they were without homes, too, and often that they would consolidate their families and have extended families live in one house. So they would be often crowded, and that would be conducive to carrying disease. If there were an epidemic of any kind, it would spread very rapidly, particularly things like smallpox, diphtheria, and a big one was tuberculosis. We had many people succumb to tuberculosis. In my family, I had 5 aunts and uncles who died early with tuberculosis about that time.
What about in terms of language and passing on cultural heritage from one generation to another?
Every part of a culture would diminish at that time. And I think that the Oneida language suffered greatly because if the Oneidas had to leave this reservation to go to Menasha, to work in the Menasha woodenware, to Milwaukee, to Sturgeon Bay, to go to the reservations in the north to find work as a laborer of some kind, they weren't speaking to other Oneidas. They were using English more than they were using Oneida. And the next generation or their children would not be learning the Oneida language.
So you were going to read us an excerpt from the Oneida journals. Do you want to just give a little bit of background before you get into it?
This is a journal by Andrew Beechtree. Andrew Beechtree was quite well educated in his own language, Oneida, and in the English language. He had gone to boarding schools, and he had been working in Detroit in an automobile factory. And when the Great Depression came, he was without employment in Detroit, and so came home to a little piece of land that had been his father's allotment. And he became one of those 30 Oneida speakers who were part of this WPA project. And he writes this: Recollections and Conclusions of an Oneida Indian. During the lean years of the Great Depression, the whole nation was hard-pressed to furnish employment to its millions of unemployed inhabitants. The result was the national, state, and local government officials and every other capable organization was thinking up work or occupations of many types and descriptions. By a streak of fate, some Oneidas say it was through the intervention of their native god, Dehalu Hiahuago, the once eminent but now humble Oneida Indians, a former member of the great Iroquois Confederacy, was given consideration. The project affecting us, the Oneidas, had for its object the recording, for the first time, the language or dialect of the Oneidas in a methodical or scientific manner. To attain this goal, the process necessitated was, among others, the establishing of an alphabet that would fit our particular uttered sounds or speech, the learning of the alphabet, the gathering of words and stories which gave us the words as applied, the translation into the English language, and the making of a dictionary. The result from this undertaking was so satisfactory and interesting that a correlated research project, the historical study, was immediately sponsored and approved. This embraces the writing of biography, autobiography, consulting newspaper and other records. In writing an account of my life and thoughts, I wish to acknowledge the opportunity and inspiration accorded me by the WPA administration. And those are the words of Andrew Beechtree, one of the project participants.
When you're referencing the sky god, he who holds the skies, why would he say that? Why would he say that this program was an intervention by a god?
Well, most Oneidas were Christian people. Many of them belonged to the Episcopalian faith, and others of them belonged to the Methodist Church. But at the same time, they did not forget their traditional teachings. And their traditional teachings had to do with thanking the Creator every day for everything that made their life what it was. I think that he was thankful for this project because in terms of economics, it was a saving grace for probably 30 families at least. And that's why he did that. Andrew Beechtree is not going to forget his teaching from his childhood or the cultural and traditional things that were brought with the tribe from New York to Wisconsin.
What about in terms of cultural heritage and the preservation of the language?
It was especially provident, I think, that this project came to the Oneidas at this time. The notebooks are like precious nuggets of information that we would never have if it had not been for this project.
Tell me a couple of your favorite stories that came out of the journals that when you first read them stuck with you.
Many of the stories that impressed me were the witch stories. It was well known that there were witches in the community, and some witches did rather good things and some witches did rather negative things. Some of the stories had to do with an animal bothering, say a dog chasing cattle incessantly, very disturbing, harmful to the animals, so that a man wanted to get rid of the pesky dog so that he would come out and shoot the dog that was bothering the cattle. And then the next day, people would see an elder woman limping through the village or limping in her area, and they would say, aha, that is the witch who became an animal and bothered those cattle. So that would be called shape-shifting. And there were many, many stories that were kept in the notebooks in that regard.
To the Oneida culture, what's the value of stories like that?
Well, there's great value. There's great value not only to the Oneida culture, but to all cultures in the United States in particular. Other people should understand their neighbors. We should understand our neighbors also, and what they are and what they do and why they do it, and understand it. And conversely, other folks who surround us or moved onto the reservation in particular or in the surrounding cities should know something about our culture. To the Oneida people in particular, these stories have value of who we are, where we came from, why we did things the way we did them, and not be lost forever. And I do believe that we have lost some things forever. But in this particular case, we do have them because they are written by Oneida people who spoke Oneida and could also do very well in the English written word. There were not any stories written down by Oneida people prior to this time. There may have been, and occasionally we find, a letter or two from those folks who had gone to the boarding schools in the East, Hampton in Virginia, and Carlisle in Pennsylvania, who became well educated from 1872 forward and would write letters back to their families. And occasionally we have some stories in them, but not a deliberate project that would capture as many stories as possible by interviewing other Oneidas. And many of the Oneidas who were interviewed spoke only Oneida and not a word of English. So we would never have had them had this project not been conducted.
But if nothing had ever been written down, how did they create a written language?
This is the first because we did not have a written language. We did have missionary Eleazar Williams, who was Mohawk.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation, but there is more where that came from. To hear the full interview, please consider joining our Patreon. Your support will help keep the stories coming and out in the world where they belong. Learn more in the show notes or on our website, peoplesrecorder.info. Thank you for your support. This is Chris Haley. Thanks for listening.